Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of Guitar and Pen. I'm your host, Mark Will in Taipei, and I'm joined today by Craig Branch, the host of the Can't Find My Way Home podcast, and Mr. Branch is in Germany. How are things over there?
Hey Mark, thanks for having me on this first episode of the Guitar and Pen podcast. In Germany, the weather is, yesterday was good, today not great. It's a bit like that. This summer's been pretty much like that. But yeah,
I'll
I'm
bet
looking
it's
forward
hotter
to
here.
just a bit, I think.
Okay, well, for this first episode, at your request, you called the tune. We will be analyzing the Smiths' third album, The Queen is Dead. Now, I'll just give a little bit of background information on the album for those that don't know. This is the Smiths' third album. It was actually released on June 16th, 1986, which is Bloomsday, the international celebration of James Joyce and his novel Ulysses. And this is an album with many literary allusions, so I suppose that's appropriate. But it was rated by NME as the greatest album of all time, according to their 2013, what was it, a reader's poll? Or maybe that was like their editor's poll. But the greatest album of all time. Now, you had sent me an article which described it as being overrated. I wonder how you feel about that. Is it overrated? Why did you want to focus on this album? And how can we approach it as from the perspective of songwriters, musicians, producers, and so on?
I think what you see in this album, The Queen is Dead, is the transformation of a band, the way the band have grown musically, lyrically, politically, monetarily, all of those different factors, sonically, of course, all of these different factors. And I think whereas their earlier albums, as we were just talking about before we press record there, about an album like Hatful of Hollow, it's a bit spikier, a bit more energetic, I would say. There's a lot more angst in a punk kind of way in that record, whereas The Queen is Dead's a bit more sophisticated, or maybe they had more time, more money to do what they wanted to do in this sense.
It does seem more
but
slick, I guess. I don't know if that translates to being more commercial, but there's like we can hear synths and strings, more polished.
There's a trumpet
maybe
in there. Yeah, exactly. I think there's also, was it like a 7 or 9 month delay in actually getting the record out, because there was all sorts of either production troubles, or there was troubles with the title, or there was all sorts of things that prevented the album. I think it was due for release earlier than what it was, or at least that's what I read.
Okay. Well,
I think we've seen a band in flux here in this album.
A band in flux. Okay, do you think, I mean, of course many people have talked about the tension between Johnny Marr, the guitar of the equation, and Morrissey, the pen. Do you think that's obvious on this record, or is it more prevalent than in previous releases?
Definitely the latter, those two questions, I would say. When you look into a band's back catalogue, of course, you're going to have highs and lows and peaks and troughs, and there might just be albums that are a complete non-starter for some. But I think what makes this album stand out, is it the best album I've ever... We could be here all day arguing that or talking about it. But what makes this album stand out are the combination of maturity in the guitar playing and the songwriting. And I think Morrissey's lyrics have actually... I don't know if these lyrics were around for a long time, but they all came to fruition in this album. And his lyrics are that kind of classic Marmite thing, you know, this either you either love them or you hate them, and he was divisive before he was divisive, if that makes sense, right? I think he had a platform and he used it, and then he thought, okay, this is, people are obviously enjoying this, so let's do it some more.
Well, I think it was around this time that he called out the Band-Aid project. You know, he wasn't impressed with those celebrities and their
maybe they didn't ask him
charity single.
That's what it was.
Yeah, maybe he was snubbed, and that's the reason for his comments. But
when you look at that video, that Band-Aid video, there's people from the Thompson Twins and all sorts of other kind of mad bands from the 80s in that video. Paul Young. I mean, I could probably could name a few more off, and you're just like, well, so why was it Morrissey? I'd said, or Ian McCulloch from Echo and the Bunnymen, you know.
Well, I think this is one of the things I mentioned in our text messages before we recorded. You know, they weren't really part of that second British invasion. Like in the States, we were not really aware of who the Smiths were. They didn't have like a major presence on MTV. Of course, they weren't played on FM radio, but I wonder how different it was in the UK. Like what was your exposure to them? I know you saw them live, actually.
I was lucky enough to see them live twice. The first one, my first ever gig in September 1985 at the Glasgow Barrowlands. That was a Meet Us Murder tour, and the second and last time I saw them was for this Queen is Dead tour. I think that was in July or something, 86, and that's when they introduced the second guitarist, right? So it was all of these changes were happening. People like, there's another guitar player, we need another guitar player. But yeah, it was what it was. But exposure wise, I remember seeing them on Top of the Pops, and they played Hand in Glove. So from that, Hand in Glove's maybe from the first album, but also from the Hatful of Hollow album. But instead of Morrissey singing it, it was Sandy Shaw who was singing. So the band are playing, or miming in a Top of the Pops kind of fashion, and Sandy Shaw was singing it instead of Morrissey. And I think that was the kind of catalyst for just saying, well, I'll see how far I can push this.
And where was Morrissey? He was off stage? He didn't even appear?
Probably... No, he's just couldn't be arsed, you know. So he's just like, let's do it this way.
Interesting.
But I think exposure-wise, at one point they were probably the darlings of the music press, the NME or the Melody Maker or Record Mirror that I used to buy, or Cut magazine. There was all of Vox. There was loads of these magazines, long gone now, but they would... Yeah, it would be more focused on Morrissey rather than the band, I've found.
Yes.
But they definitely had a lot of exposure on nighttime radio, so from like 7 p.m. till midnight. Janice Long, Andy Kershaw, the John Peel Show, of course, was the catalyst for many great bands.
He was an early supporter and fan, right? He did a lot to promote them.
I mean, he was the type of... He obviously had that punk ethic as well. If you sent him a demo and he listened to it, he might play it on the radio. It was a bit like that, you know. And
right.
I think the Smiths from their early days garnered enough momentum in the press that they were quite... everyone knew who they were, let's put it that way.
And see, we didn't really have a John Peel equivalent in the States, and even if we had, you know, I'm not sure that such a person would have gotten behind a British band, right? Like maybe such a person would promote the darlings of college radio like REM and 10,000 Maniacs, who I guess would be American equivalents of the Smiths with that jangle pop kind of vibe. But we should point out that this very literary album is actually an allusion to this great book, which I happen to have in my library. This is Hubert Selby Jr.'s Last Exit to Brooklyn. Probably his best book, in my opinion. And one of the sections is called The Queen is Dead. There was also a movie made about it.
I saw the movie, yeah.
It's Wim Wenders, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. It's not the cheeriest of films, but I think Mark Knopfler did the soundtrack.
Oh, okay. Well, that would have come out. That would have come out in the 80s too, right? Like it would have been more or less the same time that this album that alludes to the novel came out. I don't know if you know, but that particular section of the novel, well, the queen in question is a young transsexual who does in fact die. So it's not clear what Morrissey is alluding to, and it is Morrissey. He's the lyricist. He's the idea man behind the concept album. But he's talking about the literal Queen of England too, her lowness, which we'll get into when we discuss the title track. But an interesting title for the album. And then the cover art, you had something to say about that. This French actor, the James Dean of France, apparently. Who is this?
Delon. And so Alan Delon, and I couldn't actually tell you many of these films because they were all in French, right? So, but he was that biggest French movie star, probably of the late 50s, maybe definitely the 60s and the 70s, and that was probably his peak. But he has that kind of classic Hollywood look to him. He's a kind of good-looking guy and whatnot. But instead of maybe ask the question, why not put James Dean on the cover instead of Alan Delon? But this might be Morrissey's kind of, some people might call it pretentious approach to things, or other people might call it a nuance. But definitely got people asking questions. One of the gigs that I went to, either the first or the second one, I remember buying a packet of, in the UK we call them badges, I believe you call them pins. Right, so I think I bought a poster or a T-shirt, whatever. You go to the gig and you buy your stuff, your merch. And I bought a little bag of 10 pins, I think it was, and each of these pins or badges had one of the covers from the records at that time, so it would be a single or an album, and one of them was The Queen is Dead. So it must have been the second time I saw them then. And of course, you would put them on your jacket, your denim jacket, whatever, and people are, what's that? Because it didn't actually say The Queen is Dead or anything on it. It was just a picture of this kind of, you're just like, what is it? So from that point of view, it was quite interesting.
What, especially at that age, people are very socially conscious of the music they follow, and I think I mentioned to you that the Smiths, I had heard of them, and there were some people I knew that listened to them, but it was like what we called the skaters and the new wave kids, and I wasn't really in that clique. So at the time this album came out, I was pretty much oblivious. This was like my Van Halen period, I guess, or my Bon Jovi period. So they weren't really on my radar. It was later that I discovered the power of the Mar Morrissey guitar and pen songwriting team. What was it like for you in Scotland in terms of the social aspect?
As I was mentioning earlier, it was definitely that Marmite thing. You either like them, you might not be a huge fan, but you like them, or you really were the complete polar opposite. And I thought, let's talk about the people who didn't like them or don't like them. They just thought he was a bit whiny and always complaining about dying and no one loving you ever, and all this kind of like mournful, not even just angst, but just kind of whining and moaning, and it's a bit, I think from what I remember anyway at that time, they didn't really like the sound of his voice, so they didn't like the way he sang. Because he was breaking all these rules, yeah? He was breaking all these conventions. He wasn't singing, and he was just, as Morrissey, he was singing. Yeah? So it was quite unique at the time. When we went to the shows, when we went to these gigs in the Glasgow Barrowlands, which is a famed venue in the East End of Glasgow, just outside the city centre, man, the first time I saw them, I can just remember near the end of the gig, he comes on with like a kind of Christmas tree, like a pine tree thing, and he's waving it about, and all people are throwing flowers, and it was just mental, It was fantastic, and I was 15 the first time I saw them, so I really didn't know my ass from my elbow, maybe as I still don't, but it was just such a joyous experience, because you had this combination of a great band, really tight, really young, and this kind of dynamic frontman who was breaking the norms and the conventions of what a frontman should be. And I think that's really what elevated them, in my opinion. And in the UK, as I was saying, they were a bit of a mixed reception, if I'm being honest. I think there was a certain demographic or age group that really dug them, and then they got to an age, and then they were like, oh yeah, that's just the student music or bedsit music or whatever they would describe it as,
Well, I think you were saying that there was something of a punk vibe to those shows, in that they played a lot of songs, a lot of short songs very quickly, almost like a Ramones gig, right?
Yes, I was sitting the other night and I was listening to it, and it just made me laugh because there was no talking. I think in the second, so both of those Barrowland gigs I listened to fairly recently, the second one, Johnny Marr just says, oh, and this is Craig Gannon, the new guitar player, and everyone goes, yeah, and then they play another song. It's
right.
That was the limit of crowd interaction, vocally anyway.
Nice. Well, that's often the best way. The crowd work is often tedious. We come to the show to hear music, not to hear chatter, exactly. Right?
There wasn't a cell phone in sight. There was no one filming the gig or whatever.
Exactly.
I'm sure they were recording it on a little Walkman type device or a tape recorder of some sorts. But yeah, that's another story. There's a great.
You mentioned the Walkman, the 80s audio artifact, the Walkman. We'll get into that in our track by track analysis. But carry on.
Best invention ever, man. Changed my life.
Well, I certainly had one. Well, let's get into the individual tracks now that we're almost 20 minutes into our intro. That took a little bit longer than I thought, but that's a good thing. So the album opens, and we should say the entire album is under 40 minutes, right? It clocks in at 36 minutes, 48 seconds, if we're to believe Wikipedia, and that sounds about right. The title track, though, is not one of those punk 3-minute punk tunes or 2-minute punk tunes, right? It's kind of an extended jam. It goes on for 6:27, and I have to say that I feel at times, even though it's quite a rocking tune in many ways, I feel like it goes nowhere, like I keep expecting it to transition to a middle 8 or a bridge or something, but it always seems to come back to
a loop.
It's a bit of a loop, and then it ends with that looping refrain, life is very long when you're lonely, which kind of establishes a theme for the entire record. Heaven knows he's miserable now. That's like a constant, thematic element throughout the entire record. But it opens with this interesting sample from a film, like a music hall film, Take Me Back to Dear Old Blighty. Blighty being a euphemism for the UK. So from the outset, it establishes itself as a specifically British record, which is
I would say English rather than British, but maybe that's maybe me just being a bit pedantic.
Well, so. No, I think that's an important distinction. I should be more careful with my terminology. You're right. English, it doesn't include, other.
I don't think there's anything of the other parts of the United Kingdom in Morrissey's lyrics or music except England, which is fine, right? I don't really have a problem with that per se, but he's definitely English.
Well, Irish blood, English heart, as he said later.
Okay, I take that one back.
Well,
fair point.
As a Scot, how did that affect you? Like this very, or in general, like how do you feel about these British bands that embrace the Union Jack? Not that the Smiths did that, but there's kind of a similar vibe there, like what we expect with the Who and later Oasis. This kind of
exactly.
We are Brits, we are English. I should say. Like what, as a Scot, what is your reaction to that, or does it matter at all?
It's a good point. I think, for example, if you look at Oasis, they got away with it, maybe just because they were in the right place at the right time. If even that's the name of an Oasis, it's like an Oasis song. But yeah, there was a definite rebirth of Britpop or whatever at that time, so it seemed to fit the bill.
Right.
The Who, on the other hand, before my time, as in a real live band, with the original lineup, so who knows what they did. But that whole Quadrophenia thing was very Union Jack, and growing up as a kid, we had mods and we had people like ska and two-tone and that kind of stuff, or new wave. And the mods used to wear the parkas, and they had that bullet or whatever it's called, the target on the back.
The target,
yeah.
The high numbers.
So I guess it's always been around, But to be honest, as a 15, 16-year-old, or maybe I was 14 when I started listening to them, it didn't really make any difference to me then. I think now I can see a certain difference. And maybe this is just the way Morrissey intended it to be. I don't think because he's of Irish parentage, I think, or grandparents or something like that. So
sure.
It's kind of...
All of them are. All of the Smiths are. Marr, Morrissey, Rourke, Joyce, all Irish lads from Manchester.
Exactly. So, but it's an interesting Englishness that I think he liked to paint and portray in a lot of his lyrics as well.
Yeah, well, there's definitely an ambiguity there, right? Like he's embracing it to some extent, but he's also highly critical. There's almost a Sex Pistols vibe there, and I think at one point Morrissey said he wanted to be as, non-mainstream as the Sex Pistols, but as popular as the Beatles. That was his vision of the Smiths. Oh, and the Smiths, by the way, the name of the band, that was inspired by one of Ionesco's plays. It's in this edition here, a collection of his plays, The Bald Soprano. There's a family called the Smiths, and I've heard that it was these banal characters in one of his Theater of the Absurd plays that was the inspiration for the band name. So again, the allusions abound. You mentioned the non-standard or sort of unorthodox vocal stylings of Morrissey, and he alludes to that in this title track too. He imagines himself confronting the Queen, and she says, "I know you and you cannot sing," and in response he says, "That's nothing, you should hear me play piano." So he had a really self-deprecating view of his unique vocal style, which I very much appreciate. And on this track you can hear him, it's almost like a hiccup or wail or something. Like he sounds very odd and unique. So I think at the time it was something that people had not heard before, which is always good.
There's one more thing I wanted to add about the track itself. I think you covered everything really well there. Did you ever hear about there was an intruder into Buckingham Palace in 1982, a guy called Michael Fagan?
No.
Didn't know. So, yeah, to cut a long story short, as I just described, he broke into Buckingham Palace, and he was, I don't know how close or how, if he was in the same wing as the Queen or whatever it was. I didn't go into too much research on him, but I remembered this just in the last day or two. And I think in the lyrics there's something there as well about the absurdity of them and us, or them being the royal family. And
yes. And there's mention of
the farce of it all.
Right. And there's mention of the protagonist, the persona of the song, carrying a spanner, right? Like
right.
A wrench. Did this guy, when he broke in, did he have a weapon of some sort? Like his idea was to smack old Lizzie in the head with the spanner?
I thought we'll leave that up to the listeners and viewers to find out for themselves, because
that's interesting.
I couldn't. Yeah, I thought I'd touch on it, and then we can have a chat about it online.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's carry on. Track number 2. This is one of those shorter, more punk tracks, frankly. Mr. Shankly. Interesting title. To me, it's bouncy jangle pop. There's almost something Beatlesque about it.
I think it's the length of the song as well that adds to that.
Yeah.
Beatles-ish kind of feel to it.
Right.
Short lyrics. Well,
right.
The lyrics there's not a lot of lyrics.
Like early Beatles, like you could imagine it on something like Beatles for Sale. Maybe
2 minutes and change.
Hard Day's Night. Exactly, yeah. Some great lines from Morrissey again. I want to go down in musical history. I'd rather be famous than righteous or holy. And then there's reference to bloody, awful poetry, which, he's addressing the eponymous Mr. Shankly, but he could very well be talking to himself too, right? Like it's kind of like an ironic look at song lyrics, which some people might describe as bloody, awful poetry, right?
What is it? It's not beauty's in the eye of the beholder, so I guess to some extent that's true lyrically as well. Frankly, yeah. Mr. Shankly, you have that classic, for me, Smith's style. There's no messing around. It just kind of starts and you're like, oh, right, it was right off the bat, here we go. And there's that kind of interesting, as you mentioned there about the lyrics, that kind of interesting complexity of the nature of the lyrics, as well as the kind of simplicity of the music, take that as a compliment, because it's quite... I couldn't imagine what it was like if someone came in with lyrics like that, and said, okay, here, this is... And I'd be like, all right, where do we start,
Well,
so
I think the music always came first, right? Like we have to imagine Johnny Marr jamming and saying, okay guys, I've got this chord progression, and he teaches it to the rhythm section, he teaches it to Rourke and Joyce, and then Morrissey hears it and he just looks in his notebook and finds whatever scribblings will go with the music, and there you have it. And this is a great way to work. I can say that my own songwriting often evolves that way. Like I start with the music first, and then the lyrics often come later. But that certainly seems to be the way they worked.
As we talked about earlier about that Britishness of it, to put Mr. Shankly into context, there is a well-known person in the UK called Shankly. Now, it's a bit of a tangent, but bear with me. Right? So
Yeah,
in the
tell me.
1960s and 70s, Bill Shankly, a Scottish football manager, was the man who made Liverpool the team that they are today. Right. So if any of our people listening, they know their football history, soccer, football. Bill Shankly was the man who changed the face of Liverpool FC, right? So they're one of the most successful teams in world football. But Bill Shankly was the catalyst for all this, because when he joined the team, the team were rubbish, right? So that was a bit, they were in the second division and they were going nowhere. And he completely revolutionised them. And there was an acrimonious breakup when he left. He left the band when he left the team, so he was a very controlling figure, and he wanted, it got to the point where they actually had to, I don't think they fired him, but they had to ask him to leave because he was there 24/7, or he was just a complete obsessive and a control freak and all these other things. So there might be a kind of little parallel there about Mr. Shankly.
Well, the Mr. Shankly in the song seems to be some kind of impresario, or almost a Malcolm McLaren sort of figure, right? Or a Richard Branson or something. He's either a record executive or a movie producer or something.
Onto something, yeah. God, Richard Branson, God forbid, right?
Yeah. But yeah, he must have, the name Mr. Shankly must have been an allusion to this footballer. Very good to know. Or at least
it's kind of
rattling around in
with
his
a lot
head.
Of listeners, yeah.
Yeah. Liverpool, there's another Irish enclave, right? Like
Absolutely.
Manchester.
Mm.
I think some other Irish musical legends may have come from there, but we'll talk about them in another episode. All right, so track number 3, I Know It's Over. This is one of the longer tracks, clocking in at 5:49. I think Morrissey's baritone his baritone voice sounds quite good on this. And it's when I first noticed the unique bass attack of Mr. Rourke. I feel like he has I'm quite sure he's using a pick, right? Like he's not playing with his fingers. You can hear all that fret noise. It's a pretty aggressive attack. It reminds me of my own punk style attack on the bass, so I have to like it. But it does sound good, and the rhythm section is really locked in on this track. I don't know what else to say other than to throw out a few lines. It's so easy to hate. It takes guts to be gentle and kind.
I think this is one of Morrissey's best vocal performances. It's a tragic love affair of some sorts. I don't know, but it's as I was listening to it over the last few days again, and I really believe it's over. Listening to him and just the kind of melancholic nature of everything, and it's just a beautiful song.
Melancholy, that's an important word. I want to talk about that when we discuss the next track, but it doesn't get much more melancholy than I Can Feel the Soil Falling Over My Head, does it? Repeated ad infinitum. Right, there's several of these songs that end in these refrains. They almost become like chants, It's just like a continual droning on of misery and despair and despondency.
I think that's a great point, actually. Misery, despondency. There's it's not just angst or heartbreak or any of the normal things we're used to in love songs per se, but I'd never heard anything like this from a ballad. It was just the way it was portrayed. It really moved. It still moves me today.
Yeah, he takes it to another level. It's not like I have a broken heart, I'm a sad teenager, and I won't make it to the high school prom or whatever. This is serious. It's like suicidal, you know.
And I believe him. I mean, I really believe him. And it's
Well,
just,
yeah.
but
Yeah.
you're right. The actual playing on the track as well, from a musical point of view, it just fits perfectly. It's very, from a drumming point of view, it's a very simply played song. It's played to what the song requires, and I think that kind of exemplifies Mike Joyce's style. You know, he's that type of drummer, meat and potatoes drummer, but I mean that with all the compliments I could give him as a young man. See him on the drum riser as a 15 and 16-year-old, and just thinking, yeah, I want to do that, man. That's how cool is that, you know?
Well,
Because he just looked like me, or he looked like a normal guy. You know, Johnny Marr always had that bit of a pop star look about him, with the shades and the big hollow-bodied guitar and whatnot.
Yeah.
And Andy Rourke was the bass player, so there was a kind of certain mysticism to them in that respect.
Well, I mean, you're a drummer yourself. Was he one of the first inspirations and influences for you? Like, what?
Yeah, absolutely.
Was it seeing him that made you say you're going to try it yourself, or were there others before him?
I think there was others before that. I can't really remember who they were, if I'm being honest. But drummers of that time, you know, or maybe old. We go back to the Beatles or Motown or wherever it was I was listening to, or Budgie from Susie and the Banshees.
I was just thinking of Budgie, yeah.
Pete DeFreitas from Echo and the Bunnymen, or Bobby Gillespie from Jesus and Mary Chain days. You know, it might have just been that whole thing that was going on as a drummer. I just really enjoys playing. As I was saying, he's a no nonsense, no frills kind of player, but it's exactly what you would expect for this type of band, because Morrissey takes up so much room and Johnny Marr takes up the rest of the room, so there's not much room for the other two to kind of...
Yeah, the rhythm section has to just keep things locked down.
And they do it brilliantly.
And they do, yeah. Well, since we're talking about him, you know, he famously sued Morrissey and Marr. I think Rourke did too, but settled out of court.
For something ridiculous, $100,000 or something like that. I mean, it was buttons.
Yeah. I mean, his argument was, Joyce's argument, that is, was I wasn't a session guy that they called in. I was the Smiths drummer, so I deserve my, I don't know if it was exactly a quarter share, but, you know, I deserve more than I've gotten, you know.
Yeah, he's not a hired hand, exactly, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I read, you know, Morrissey's perspective in his autobiography, but that's just his perspective, right? And there's I'm sure there's another side to the story, and apparently the courts agreed that Joyce was entitled to more, because I think he, you know, ended up being awarded quite a bit more than he had.
$1 million or something like that.
Oh, okay. Huh. That doesn't sound like so much, but maybe it's enough to keep him off the welfare rolls.
Or the pub circuit for a while.
Yeah.
You know? Or the Smiths tribute bands, I'm sure that he was flooded with invitations for. But maybe there's an interesting dynamic in the relationship between the songwriters, the lyricists, and the main songwriter, and the other two guys in the band. You know, it seemed to be, I think, as the band evolved, you might have seen this kind of natural split in the band as well. It's like them and us.
Yeah, well,
and then it didn't end well.
And then there was a split between the two main creative geniuses, so it just was fracturing all around eventually. But basically, you think his appeal is that he had kind of an everyman or workman-like quality to his
and a bit
playing.
Of punk ethic as well. You know, it's like anyone can do it. We can all do it.
Right. Yeah.
You don't need big giant drum kits or to be in
Yes.
Yes or anything like that. Or you
Yeah.
can just get your mates and start doing it.
There you go. Exactly. Okay, well, side one closes out with the charming Symmetry Gates, and it is symmetry with that unique spelling. And it's, again, a short one, under 3 minutes. More of that jangle pop, I would say. Quite a...
It's a 2 minutes and change, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's just it reminds me a bit, if the Smiths did pop songs, then this album has a few of them on it. I would say this is definitely one. It has that kind of catchy little rhythm to it.
It is catchy. It is memorable. It's a good tune, we would say.
The BPM's up a little bit.
Yes. Yeah.
It's got a hook.
Right.
And then you've got the title, right? Just to kind of defeat all of that kind of simplicity that makes it work. And then you have this title about Cemetery Gates, and it's about, okay. Maybe you can tell us about the lyrics and what you think of them, Mark.
Well, of course, there's the contrast between Keats and Yeats on one side, his interlocutor's side, and then he himself, Morrissey, the boy with the thorn in his side, is on the side of Weird Lover Wilde, meaning Oscar Wilde. And, of course, that reminds us of his appearance on one of those shows. Was it Top of the Pops, when he had the flower in his pocket? And that of course, is a Wildean gesture. I'm actually reminded of a Bob Dylan song when he says, "I've read well." It reminds me of that line from Ballad of a Thin Man. "You've been through all of F. Scott Fitzgerald's books. You're very well read. It's well known." I don't know if he had that in mind, but certainly seemed to be an allusion to that. And I think he, I don't know if there's a weird British or what, Mancunian pronunciation of the word.
Mancunian.
Mancunian, sorry. He says plagiarize. Is that what I'm hearing? Instead of plagiarize? It sounds like plagiarize, but maybe I'm hearing it wrong. You know what I'm talking about?
Check out. Yeah, I know the line, yeah. I need to go back and check it out. I think is it a filler on the album? When you look at the B-sides that were released, there was a song called Rubber Ring, there was another song called Asleep, one or two other B-sides that I can't quite remember at the moment, but they seem they could have been on the album, and this might have been a question mark. Not question mark, but a question mark. Is it one of them? Do we keep it or do we not? Do we put it on the B-side or not? I think it's one of those interchangeable songs. It's a nice little pop ditty. 2 minutes and change.
Yeah. Well, it could have been, you're saying it could have been replaced by something like Panic, right? The single.
Asleep was another one.
Yeah. Well, that takes us to
It seems like... Oh, we actually missed one. We missed Never Had No One Ever.
Oh, we did. We got to go back to track number 4. I jumped ahead. Yeah, and that's actually an important one because we were talking about the melancholy aspect here, and I think he's most miserable on this song. It's kind of a continuation of track 3. Maybe that's why I skipped over it. But I had the thought that this British melancholy, or the British anatomy of melancholy, is it equivalent to the American blues? Can we say that, like, the British melancholy of the Smiths, and then, like, I don't know, Led Zeppelin's Black Dog, right? Like the melancholy is called Black Dog, and that's Led Zeppelin kind of seemed to understand the connection between that British melancholy and the American blues. But can we say that like the Melancholy of Morrissey is the UK equivalent of American blues, like a native kind of homegrown, despondent kind of music?
That's a great point. I think it's important to point out to anyone who doesn't know or who wasn't around the UK at that time, in the 1980s we were living under the regime of Margaret Thatcher. Unemployment was at an all-time high. Hence the name, the band name UB40. They had a song called 1 in 10. It was the number, how many people were unemployed at the time. And I think in this album, somewhere lyrically, there's also a reference to the unemployment figures or something like that in one of the tracks. I forget which one. But from that point of view, I think, is it like a bit like the blues? Yes and no. I think there are certain elements of it you can definitely take, but I think there are other things that kind of separate it. More so musically rather than lyrically, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, maybe it's like the pasty white man's kind of blues.
Bedsitter, it's like that kind of student woes, and there's this, because that's the thing. I think blues has a more appeal to a wider demographic, a wider range of people, whereas the Smiths, I think, is probably the opposite.
More niche,
type of, exactly. Niche is a good word to describe it. Yeah.
Although when I look at the number of listens on Spotify, it doesn't seem that niche.
Someone's listened to it.
Hundreds of millions of listens. But yeah, in this song too, some really great lines. I had a really bad dream. It lasted 20 years, 7 months, and 27 days. I mean, where do you hear?
Heavy, man.
Yeah, that's such a. There's so many great lines like that, and multiple great lines per track. We're only.
Well, we should say we haven't really swapped notes, but what notes I did write about this song, I just basically wrote down. It's more like a poem set to music with a nice jam that fades out at the end. That was my notes.
Well, this one is a bit of a jam. There's some jamming, not quite like the title track. There's a kind of haunting
aspect to the song as well, I think, in the sound of the music.
Yeah. Well, that's a good way to describe a lot of their songs. It's like poetry with a melancholic poetry, let's say, with a beat. So, shall we take a quick break before we start side 2? Let's
do it.
Hit pause and get some water and be right back.